The first Canadian typeface was published a mere 50 years ago. It was a somewhat retro affair, harking back to the earliest days of typography, circa 1500, and named by its designer Carl Dair after an explorer from that era, Jacques Cartier, who had mapped the Gulf of St. Lawrence in the 1530s. But in 1967, Canada was looking forward, especially exemplified by Expo 67 with its monorail, its geodesic dome, habitat, and official documents using the typeface universe. So, what was Carl Dair thinking? How was he so out of sync with the times? I will attempt to answer that and tell you the story. Last year, in my endeavors as a bibliophile, I acquired a nice old book from 1968, which for typography captivated me, and I read the whole damn thing, even though I wasn't particularly interested in the content. Now, why should that be when, according to the tenets of readability that we have today, this typography falls far short? You'll notice in particular, in a word like monsieur, that the S is really cramped. In the previous word later, there's oceans of space around the letter T. If you look at the M in the monsieur, the strong diagonal stroke is way heavier than a comparable stroke in the capital letter A few lines below. If you look at the lowercase letter m, it's much larger and taller in X height than many of the other lowercase letters, as if it came from a different size font. So, and in the italic, which we see over here, it's downright bizarre with the very condensed lowercase and no italic capitals. They're just borrowed from the uppercase. So, did I like this typography because of these features or in spite of these bugs? These issues were addressed by Rod MacDonald in his 2000 revival, especially with the much more serviceable italic. But in so doing, it creates a very different mise-en-page or gestalt for the typography. There have, in fact, been a number of revivals of the Cartier typeface over the years, but presently only two are available digitally, the Raleigh and Rod's version, both of which depart considerably from Carl Dair's original. So it occurred to me that for this 50th anniversary and Canada 150, a restoration would be in order. That's a term that Paul Shaw used, and I've called my effort in this regard Dair. Context and form of Dair's design. Canada lagged behind the United States and Europe in cultural matters considerably until after the Second World War, when we caught up in a hurry. Not just through market forces, but through various institutions, of which the Art Directors Club Toronto was, I think, very important. Following the model of the New York Art Directors Club, we held an annual competition every year with awards which were showcased in an annual. In those early years, Carl Dair was a frequent award winner. He was part of a graphic design studio. And down here at the bottom, we see what is the cover of a brochure for a sculpture exhibit at the Musée des Beaux-Arts in Montreal. And I can't help but notice that it's very similar in design to the cover of the annual, which is not credited to any particular designer. At the back of the annuals was a section of very splashy, showy trade ads from suppliers such as photographers, illustrators, and typesetters. This is an ad that Dair wrote and designed for Cooper & Beattie, and he also created the cartouche logo at the bottom for that company. It shows the complexity of his layout and his penchant for contrast. You'll note the headline in all lowercase Baskerville, italic, and compare that with the signature in Futura extra bold capitals, letter-spaced at the bottom. A couple of years later, Dair is advertising his services as a foundry type typesetter of exotic European types, such as Post Antiqua. And even though he restricts himself just to the one typeface, all caps, he still manages to put in a fair amount of contrast using 4 different sizes of the type, mixing flush left and centered layout, and throwing in letter spacing for good measure. Here's something from 1960, a layout by Dair from a book he designed. At first glance, it's ostensibly a flush left, modernist layout with lots of white space, but you'll notice there are also elements of centering, both horizontally and vertically. And again, he contrasts the all lowercase type in one area with all caps and small caps. The typeface is Eric Gill's Pilgrim. Did I mention contrast? It was a central feature of his famous book on type design. You can see the chapter 8 is all about contrast. So it comes as no surprise that the typeface that he designed is largely built around various different dimensions of contrast. Not necessarily contrast in stroke weight, stem weight, as we now understand it, but these different ways that he's contrasted within these different parameters of design. The idea that the X height need not be standard, it's kind of a McLuhanish realization that what was once the ground of a technology can become a figure of the next generation of technology. It was recognized when, in the early 20th century, engineering drawings were used to revive much older punch-cut type forms and kind of made a feature of these idiosyncrasies. Dair, too, did that in his typeface. Cartier became something of a go-to typeface for Canadian publishers on matters of Canadian content and historical content. Very keen on it was McClelland and Stewart, the esteemed Canadian publisher. And I would suspect that Jack McClelland rather liked the way his own name looked in that typeface with its great big M and those towering ascenders. This book shows a headline style popular at the time, tight but not touching. At the top is a drawing by Patrick Griffin, thank you, Patrick, based on, very precisely, with Bezier description, on Carl Dair's original drawings for the type. And at the bottom is a scan of the headline from the book. And here's the version I did of the typeface, which I've kerned specially for the tight but not touching style of the era, which is actually, it is significantly different than, say, Adobe's optical kerning or just taking the normal font and compressing the tracking. And in comparison, the two other much more crisply detailed versions of the typeface, which create a very different impression in headlines from the softened version that Cartier was originally. In context, it does bear similarities to another couple of typefaces, at least another couple. For instance, Signet, a calligraphically informed style, amenable to close setting, with a fairly large X height and those towering ascenders again. And also George Trump's Delphine typeface, which, like the Cartier italic, has the Roman capitals and the calligraphic lowercase with the tall ascenders. As I said, coffee table books were a big thing for Cartier. These coffee table books generally had a lot of white space, modernist layouts, and to counteract the austerity of that, they often used old-style typefaces like Garamond and Bembo to provide a little bit of organic warmth. And we see a similar thing in the architecture of modernism, where wood grain, marble striation, raw concrete, beton brut were used by architects. There's the rough texture of the original Cartier. Art books, a lot of white space, so you need something with a bit of substance to kind of harmonize with the illustration. And you can just about get away with something as rough looking as this unruly Cartier italic. But on the other hand, 16-point in a big book on Canadian art on smooth paper, it really does look quite dignified. Looking at the problem of the italic, we see that in the era of phototype, there was even then such a thing as faux italics. And what the art director has done here is mechanically slanted the italic to solve the problem, or so they thought, of the lack of italic capitals, but it's rather unfortunate. And here's Rod's typeface, again with the much more comfortable effect, especially with the italic. My restoration. I worked from scans from that magic fiddler book that I fell in love with for several reasons. I think the most important is that if one looks at both letterpress typography and phototype, there was a subtle decay between the font and the printed image. Press gain in letterpress. This is a scan of some type from the 16th century. I think you can just about see the way that the sharp image has been softened in printing. And in phototype, the original, going from the original galley, there's several photographic copies made during the process which softens the type. Another reason that I worked in this manner was that with those kind of blurry scans, it does require a certain amount of drawing interpretation by my hand, not so much the brain. So it gives a slight bit of personality to it in reviving it in that manner. When it came to the Seraphs, I realized that some kind of systematic representation was necessary because designers like to look closely at details such as that. Typographers like to look at those details in order to become familiar with and identify a typeface and see how it's done at larger sizes, even if they only use it at a small size. And I was influenced by the treatment of Adobe Garamond all those years ago that doesn't have the Bezier points at the extrema of the Seraphs. One area that particularly intrigued me about the typeface, and I did refer to Dair's original drawings here, was the metrics. And I noticed that they're much narrower on the right-hand side of H, M, and N, and that's also shown in the very short serif on that side. If you look at that word learned, the first between the L and the E and between the N and the E, it's a very different it's a different distance, and that's not the way we generally do things today. And you can see it wasn't the way that it was done in either the CompuGraphic Cartier or in Rod's typeface. Why should this be? Well, I think it's because in this style of incunabular type design that they really did privilege the shape of counters as white space over the white space between letters, and certainly on a par with the effect of the positive strokes in a typeface. And the open counters were designed in such a way that when they butted up to the adjacent characters, they created pseudo counters almost closed off. And one particularly sees that in combination with the lowercase letter A. Here's Dair's drawing of the original drawings, and you can see how he's been constrained by the monotype 18 unit unitization system, which was ported from the monotype casting system to the initial crude phototype setting systems. So it provided a constraint that he worked in, and as we all know, constraints can be very productive for typefaces, and he built it a lot around that. And I think that's why that thing with the M and the N was a part of the design. You'll also note that when he draws the accents down there, the letter A is drawn the same every time. So despite all these vagaries of the typeface, they are very intentional. And I couldn't help but be reminded of a quote that stuck with me from Fred Gaudi's book that I'm pretty sure he would have been aware of. Drawings like mine, which were made freehand, were not the sort usually worked from at the monotype company. So there was a constant fight to see that the workmen did not correct what seemed to them to be bad drawing on my part. If I intentionally gave a letter an inclination of 1 degree, they straightened it up. My Seraphs, which had a definite shape, were changed to meet their own ideas, since they had always made them that way. So I think that's the kind of relationship that Dair was concerned with when he was dealing with linotype. So the question was, would I adhere very, very strictly to his original drawings, or to the original font, or to the original printed material? And I decided actually to have it both ways, because I did a version which I called Dair 67, which will in fact create a facsimile of the original printed pages in the Magic Fiddler book. And then I did a slightly more sophisticated version with kerning in it, and not with that quite such rigorous unitization of the metrics. There you can see the original scan, and the Dair 67 that creates the facsimile, and then the version I did with that was slightly more sophisticated, because I think Dair would have liked to have seen the typeface with the sophisticated kerning that was not available to him. And in making the texture of the type a bit more smoother through kerning and metric adjustment, I also decided that the X heights could be also made a little smoother, because those were two aspects that I think should work in harmony. I also added small caps and various modern features to the main font, because, well, Dair was a big lover of small caps. And in the italic, I succumbed to giving the capitals a slant in the main version, as well as providing the original facsimile version with the Roman capitals. So, in answer to the question, what was he thinking? First of all, Cartier was not really a centennial project. It was a lifetime project for Dair. He'd started on it many years ago as an expression of everything that interested him in typography and type design. And when he went to Holland to study punch cutting with Enschede, not necessarily to punch cut his type design, but because he wanted to absorb the the DNA of typography at its source, physically, with his hands. It was an exercise in critical design, not critical in the sense used by Rick Poynter to describe criticizing society, but as a means of using the process of type design to interrogate and explain the process of type design. It was an expression of Dair's belief in contrast, which was central to his work as a designer, as an intellectual, as an educator. So it's only natural that his typeface should have all those qualities in it. It was a typeface of its time because the eclecticism of the 1960s embraced historicism as well. One finds in classical music, for instance, electronic experimentation, but also the birth of the original instruments movement. It was part of a narrative of mid-century typefaces which radically explored the old style. The most prominent, of course, was Palatino, but I'm pretty sure that Cartier had influence on Les Usherwood's designs, which have a strongly brush and calligraphic feel, starting with his first big success, Caxton. And finally, it was nationally relevant, after all, in the niche of Canadian books, and famously in the full text of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms that was published in 1982, which is kind of like our Declaration of Independence. Thank you very much.